If you're watching, please like and subscribe. I am exceptionally lucky to have the one, the only, Jack Monroe with the world's most excellent jumper, which if you're listening to this on the podcast, is... You can describe it, Jack. I'll let you describe your own jumper.
It's actually a replica of Princess Diana's famous sheep jumper that she wore to the polo in 1979. Now, I'm not a natural royalist, but as a child, I was slightly obsessed with Princess Diana because my mum used to go and visit an elderly lady from church called Gladys, and I would sit in her porch reading her like society magazines at the age of like 8, and I was very enamoured with Princess Di, and I loved that jumper, and you can get like replica versions of it, and someone got it for me for Christmas this year, and
be honest,
I was
Jack.
literally over the moon. So it's a red jumper with like loads of white sheep across it, with one little black sheep. Then where the black sheep sits tends to depend what under supporting garments I'm wearing at the time. Sometimes it's high on the hill, and sometimes it's like quite low down. Yeah, so red jumper covered in white sheep, one little black sheep in the corner. It's got sheep on the back as well. It is a really happy making jumper. It's so warm.
I was all right.
I wanted it for about 25 years.
I mean, I was quite cheerful before I came on, but I saw you got more cheerful, and then I saw you jumping out even more cheerful. Also, not only an excellent jumper, but I'm not a monarchist either, but Princess Diana, absolutely fine, legit to be a fan of hers.
Yeah, she's the legit one to like, isn't she? So it's like, yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, I'm totally over the moon with this glorious, very happy making jumper. And also, I thought it makes a change from like denim shirt, white t-shirt, black jeans. I thought, I'll just channel a hero and see how it goes.
I've just put a jumper, a hoodie on to bring out my Mardy teenager look. Jack, how is lockdown going? Tell me about lockdown.
I mean, lockdown is going, isn't it? And going. I mean, at the start of lockdown, a year ago now, I lost all of my work in like a 48-hour period. I literally lost a year's worth of work in a 48-hour period. Just emails coming in going, this talk has been cancelled, this festival has been cancelled, this has been cancelled, that's been cancelled, we're no longer doing this conference. And although people primarily know me as a writer, there's not a lot of money in that. So I primarily make my income through basically tromping up and down the country, shouting about inequality to assembled groups of professionals who are in a position to do something about it. And that all went, and had a little panic, famously quite panicky about money. And I started sort of thinking about what else I could do. I started selling my photography and started doing other like quite labor intensive stuff to try to generate like bits of income. And then I got offered a BBC TV show to teach people how to cook in lockdown with the lovely Matt Tebbert. That was a baptism of fire. Very, very long hours, very big responsibility, very, very great fun. Yeah, I came out the back of that. Like I'd been on, I don't know, like I've been on the world's most terrifying roller coaster. It was brilliant. It was also quite knackering. So I came out of that and was like, right, I don't want to do telly or anything for a while because I have done my quota for now. Yeah, just sort of hung out at home with the boy, and now we're doing some homeschooly stuff, and I'm sort of working my hours around the morning assembly and the afternoon yoga and his yoga, not my yoga. Yeah, we're sort of making it work. And I'm lucky that I've landed a few good jobs in this time period, and I'm not quite so stressed anymore about paying the bills. We're always perpetually going to be stressed about paying the bills because that's just who I am. And yeah, it's okay. It's okay. it's not the greatest, but we got corona in this house, and it was awful. And I'm still slightly knackered and coming out the other side of recovery from it. But under the like umbrella of experiences that people are having in this lockdown, I think I'm doing all right. I can't complain really, even though I am perpetually always on Twitter, but I can't really complain.
Complaining is one of the engines of social progress, I would say. I mean, Jack, there were so many things you are that like there's a list, but one of the things, I mean, you're a chef extraordinaire for a start, and you're a very, very effective campaigner. Food poverty. Now, this is something which you've really just driven on the agenda over and over again. Tell for people who don't know, how was it that became such a burning passion for you?
Well, I lived it myself. For people who don't know my backstory, I was working in the control room at Essex Fire and Rescue Service, and then I had a baby, and I went back to work after maternity leave and found that my childcare arrangements I made for working like an 8-day rolling shift pattern were not as resilient as I thought they were. Different things happened, like my son's nursery closed down, the nearest one to us, so the next nearest one was almost impossible to get him to within the time window that I needed to get to work. People who had sort of collaborated with me to look after him on night shifts, one of them fell quite gravely ill, so couldn't pick up like their sort of share of the rota, and things just started really going wrong. So I ended up being signed off sick with stress by my doctor, went with a headache, came out with beta blockers, sleeping pills, and a very strict, you do not go back to work for at least 4 weeks, and ended up resigning to look for something else. And that something else didn't materialize for quite a long time. So I was deemed to have made myself unemployed and unemployable by choosing to have a baby by the DWP, and as a result of that, didn't get benefits for a good few weeks. Ended up writing to my MP in desperation because I'd been served a Section 21 eviction notice on my flat, and I was being told I needed to look for somewhere else to live, but I didn't have an income, and I was like building up debts of bank charges and unpaid bills and unpaid rent, and no one wanted to take me on anyway, even if I'd been in a position to move. And I ended up basically at the door of a food bank with no money to feed myself and my son, and cold and miserable, and just in an absolutely desperate and destitute situation. People ask me quite a lot, oh, well, why didn't your parents help out? Why didn't your friends help out? And that question only ever comes from people who have no experience of poverty, because with the cold hands of poverty come a great deal of shame and isolation. I basically tucked myself away and didn't tell anyone how bad things were, because firstly, I grew up in a household where both my parents were foster carers, and as a result of that, from being a very young child, my childhood experience was that children would turn up at our house in the middle of the night with a plastic bag of belongings, and they would stay with us sometimes for a few days, sometimes for over a decade. But I had this inbuilt fear, because I'd experienced it happening over 100 times in my childhood, that my child would be taken away from me if people knew that we were living in cold, damp, dark. The fridge was unplugged, his shoes were too small, his joggers were riding up his legs. You know, I was scared that if I admitted to anyone how bad things were, the social would get involved, and that is a fear that is not unique to me, and is not, you know, it still happens today. I still hear from parents who say, well, I haven't asked anyone for help because I don't want people to know how bad things are. So I didn't say anything, got my head down, put my best coat on to go to the food bank. My best friend at the time was also referred to the same food bank, so we would meet up in the town centre with our buggies, and we would walk down, and we would, like, you know, just acting like two friends who were going for a chat, or, you know, going for a walk. And we'd get the food bank bag, we'd stuff it in the bottom of the buggy, and we'd sort of cover it with like a baby fleece blanket or something so people couldn't see it, and we'd carry on, you know, keep calm and carry on, and stiff upper lip and all of that nonsense is it's a very real thing. So I started to write about my experiences, and with that came a wave of what I now call poverty deniers, and people who refuse to believe that hunger and poverty in Britain exists, even though we're faced with ever more stark figures and stories and realities for every day. But also came quite a quite a big online community of support, of people reaching out and saying, I've been where you are, or it doesn't have to end this way, or just hang in. And so I'm in a better situation now, not tremendously. As you can see, I've got a nice house, got a nice jumper, but I rent this house and I'm not quite out of the woods yet, but I am no longer dirt poor, like living out of food banks. But I refuse to leave behind the people who still are. And I get a bit of criticism sometimes for still speaking about poverty and still writing cheap recipes from detractors online who are like, oh, why are you still pretending to be poor when you've got nice furniture? I'm not pretending to be poor. I'm continuing to advocate for people who are, because what kind of an arsehole would I be if I just was like, oh, well, I've got a book deal now and a couple of nice rugs and a laptop. I'll pull this nice ladder up behind me and trot off into the sunset. I can't just write cheap recipes without also, writing about the reasons why people in the 5th or 6th richest economy in the world are looking for 20p, 30p dinners in the first place. Like, one goes hand in hand with the other for me. And until nobody needs the type of work that I do, until food poverty has been resolved in this country to such a degree that nobody's Googling in the middle of the night what to do with a leftover half bag of lentils and half a tomato, I'm gonna carry on. As much as I'd love to go jollying off to the mountains in Cyprus and find my ancestors and run around with goats and write a big hardback coffee table cookbook with beautiful photos in, it's not gonna happen for a while, I don't think.
After World War II, I'm not doing a big history thing. I don't
remember it. Sorry.
I know. Yeah, for me, it's a vivid memory. It's just like yesterday. So there was this philosophy that poverty, unemployment, and injustice, they were social defects. There was something wrong with the way society was run, and therefore you needed a collective solution: the welfare state, a national health service.
Mm-hmm.
Thatcher came along, and that philosophy. I'll just read her. I'll read her own words. We'll put these to you. She said, there really is no, this was in the 70s, bear in mind, there really is no primary poverty left in this country. There may be poverty because they don't know how to budget, don't know how to spend their earnings. I'm even doing the Thatcher thumb here. But you are left with the really hard, fundamental character personality defect. I think that eloquently sums up Thatcherism. It's this idea that if poverty exists at all, then it's to do with individual failings. People aren't trying hard enough. They're not budgeting properly. What would you say to that? This whole idea of poverty is to do, that's what Thatcherism tried to teach us. It was to do with not being a go-getter and not budgeting money properly.
Well, I mean, that is an attitude that is still enormously pervasive today, isn't it? So it's nice to know where it stemmed from, but it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. I mean, 8-9 years ago when I first popped up in the press, and I only did it to pay a bill. I was offered some money to do a newspaper article about a mum that would have a really crap Christmas, and I didn't want to do it, but I thought, oh, it'll be tomorrow's chip paper, it will clear like the gas bill and buy some little Christmas presents for my son. And from the moment I first popped up, the comments that came thick and fast were that there's no such thing as poverty in this country, that you must have done something wrong, it's a series of terrible decisions, or we shouldn't have to pay for your bastard child, etc., etc. And I was like, this is a really grim and awful attitude, but it's one that is pervasive, and it still continues. It continues in Parliament. It continues in the House of Lords. It continues in the minds and in the vocabulary and the speeches of the people who make the laws and make the rules and cut the budgets that disproportionately impact the people who are living in poverty. And that was one of the reasons I got involved in local politics in the first place. Was I was a single mum on the dole, and my dad was giving me a lift somewhere. I can never quite remember exactly where it was, but we were in his car. We drove past a petrol station, And in the local paper, and they're like A board outside the petrol station, was the headline, "Druggies, drunks and single mums are ruining the high street." And I was like, "That's not the car. Have you got like 50p on you?" And he was like rooted around in that middle bit of the car where, like, you know, people keep their change. And I ran out, I ran to the petrol station, I got this paper, and it was the front page of the paper, and it was a local Tory councillor called Anna Waite, and her father ran a restaurant in the high street, a restaurant and ice cream shop, and she was bemoaning the fact that single mothers with their buggies would hang around in the high street, making it look untidy, basically, and that we were contributing to the death of the economy, and it was us and people who were, you know, unfortunately in the throes of various forms of addiction. It's not how she put it. Who were also cluttering up the place and ruining business. I was like, well, it might be something to do with your family's stinking attitude why people don't want to come to your coffee shop. But I wrote a letter to the local paper, properly kicking off about what she'd said, and decided to go to council meetings to see like who these people were, who were making these proclamations about people like me. And also, these were the same people who would shut my son's children's centre, who'd made going back to work more difficult for me, who were having a review about shutting the local library that we hung around in when it was freezing cold because it's free and there's things to look at. And I just wanted to see who they were. And so I went along and started to write about it. And that's how I've discovered that attitude is alive and well, and alive and well through every sort of, you know, every subset of society. Every rung up the ladder has got people on it who truly believe that people who are using food banks or people who are in poverty in Britain either don't exist or it's all their own fault. And I get it. It's comfortable for people to think, oh, well, you must have made some terrible decisions that I and my darling children would never make, so we will never end up in your position. It's a comfortable distancing technique to be like, oh, well, I am safe and secure and you are a wrong un. But actually, coronavirus has demonstrated and should have demonstrated to all of us that actually that's security net that people think they have is very, very patchy, and that a lot of people have found themselves in situations that they may not have imagined ever sort of coming face to face with. I mean, food insecurity has touched all of us at some point in the pandemic, whether that's running out of pasta in the supermarket or, you know, or various different, you know, things being missing or out of stock or not being able to shop in the same way that we usually would. You know, and for that to have sort of crept into almost every household in Britain in the last year, hopefully means that people might have slightly more sympathy and understanding for what it actually means to be food insecure and hungry. Hopefully.
I mean, we all know coronavirus is a public health emergency, obviously, but one of the things people often don't think about is that poverty is a public health emergency. And before the pandemic came along, the poorer you are, the lower your life expectancy, but also huge amounts of physical and mental health impacts. And we can see the pandemic's like a terrible flare lighting up and reinforcing existing injustices, because the poorer you are, the more likely you are to die from COVID-19. So how would you sum up, what is the impact of poverty on health? Not just mental health, physical health as well.
Well, I wrote something recently actually for House magazine, which is the Parliament's like in-house magazine that goes to MPs and staffers, etc., about exactly this. Because I thought I've spent the last 8-9 years talking about how we need to feed people now. People not having food is, you know, absolutely drastic. It's a ghastly way to run a country. It's a horrible thing to do. But I thought actually that message doesn't seem to be getting through. So I've switched to sort of long-term impact of childhood exposure to poverty. And I basically wrote about the fact that childhood exposure to poverty, deprivation and adversity falls under the umbrella of adverse childhood experiences, on a par with domestic abuse, childhood sexual assault, loss of a parent, parental incarceration, violence and neglect. Exposure to adverse childhood experiences increases the risk of trauma later in life. So you have less favourable health outcomes. It has a negative impact on general well-being, increased likelihood of risky or criminal behaviours, poor educational or academic outcomes, and financial difficulties. Children who experience food insecurity, even short-term, are more likely to fall ill, have a slower recovery rate than average from minor illness, and more likely to need hospital admission. And food poverty doesn't exist in a vacuum, as it's one of the most fundamental survival instincts of our species is to nourish ourselves. Food is actually one of the last necessities that people choose to cut in a crisis. So if somebody is in food poverty or living in food poverty, they're probably also in hygiene poverty, period poverty, energy poverty. And although it's helpful in some regards to break down different aspects of poverty that touch a person's life at any given time, it's also important to remember that it all just falls under one umbrella, which is poverty. And if you're experiencing one of those, it's very likely that you're experiencing other things in that bracket as well, which basically adds up to you are having a pretty shit time of it, and people need to buckle up and help. So if we look at the fact that food insecurity is linked to a higher probability of chronic illness later in life, and living in damp and unsuitable accommodation is also linked to like higher incidences of respiratory problems and lung problems, and some types of cancers. Surely it makes sense to invest now in feeding people, in keeping the universal credit uplift, in raising the amount of benefits and in-work benefits and out-of-work benefits to match a reasonable and healthy living standard, rather than be spending literally millions later down the line in NHS care and social care and support, and picking up the pieces of the seeds that have been planted all those years before. Like, just nip it in the bud and give people a chance to thrive and be their whole selves and have a bloody good start in life. Because it's just, I mean, on the one hand, the government are consistently cutting care and support for people with disabilities, and even in the pandemic, people who are disabled and shielding, they've just been sort of tucked away and not heard from, and their stories go untold, and they're sort of like forgotten about, in like Victorian era version of just sort of put them out of the way so we don't have to see them, and it's disgusting. But it's like, well, if you don't want to be creating more of these pesky, expensive, disabled people, of which I am one, well, stop starving them and freezing them in their early years of their lives, and then later on down the, I mean, it's so. I mean, I'm autistic, so I'm quite black and white about things, about cause and effect, and I'm kind of like, I don't know if it's me oversimplifying things, but depriving people of basic human needs in their formative years, leading to a higher likeliness of chronic illness, which is, expensive for the state to support. If we're talking in conservative terms, surely if we invest in people's nourishment, nutrition, and early years now, we'll save a fucking fortune later down the line. I mean, if I can't appeal to them on a human level, I'll try to appeal to them on an economic one. So, it's as grim as it is.
I mean, you played this pretty heroic role during the COVID crisis, and we saw, of course, the campaign most associated for a long time with Marcus Rashford, the football player. And this is obviously on the issue of children in this country who live in poverty, and poverty rates are getting worse even before COVID, and having support for them during summer holidays. And then, well, why don't we just explain what the government did and why? Because you caused an online sensation which put pressure on the government. What did the government do, and what does it tell us about their attitude towards children in poverty?
So originally, children who were in receipt of free school meals were eligible for a £30 supermarket voucher that could be spent at most of the major supermarkets. Now, these vouchers were only eligible to be spent on basically food products. They were blocked from age-restricted products. So that's everything from cigarettes, alcohol, razors, a vegetable peeler to peel your vegetables with, like a paring knife, chef's knife, anything that you needed to be over 16 to buy, a can of an energy drink, all of that couldn't have on these vouchers. They would physically not scan through the checkout. They would not go if you had any of those things in your basket. And I have spoken to countless supermarket workers who have backed that up and said, yeah, they literally don't work. Despite this, a small, noisy table of Conservative supporters and some MPs made lurid claims on Twitter and other social media outlets that parents were abusing these vouchers to buy cigarettes and alcohol. And I can't remember which MP it was. Was it Ben Bradley who said that they were funding crack dens, as if your local crack dealer was going to take like a 30 quid Aldi voucher in return for a whatever that would buy you. It's like, I'm not sure that that's their currency. I mean, I'm not an expert, but you know, I'm not sure that that's how it works. And so very swiftly, those vouchers were taken away because there was a public backlash about them, because rather than believing the supermarket workers and the individuals who were in receipt of the vouchers, the general public chose to believe Ben Bradley and people making ludicrous claims, because it's easier to think that poor people are feckless and awful than it is to think that, you know, they might just want some carrots and some bloody bread. And so those vouchers were taken away and replaced with a little meal hamper. And the little meal hampers were similar to the ones that were being given out to, you know, those pesky shielders through the whole of the pandemic. And people were sending me pictures of them through the months on Twitter, and I tried to rabble rouse a few times about it, but people just weren't interested. And then a Twitter user called Roadside Mum posted a photo of her food box a couple of weeks ago, and it was like 2 manky bananas, a loaf of bread, a couple of like sweaty slices of cheese, like a potato, and it was quite clearly not suitable for multiple lunches for multiple children, and B, absolutely was nowhere near the value of £20 worth of food. So we totted it up. We were like, oh, actually, this comes to, she made it £5.67. I made it slightly less, but we'll say around a fiver. Where's the other 15 quid going in this tender? Like, who is pocketing £15 out of £20 to give the kids who should be in receipt free school meals this absolutely meager and revolting box of nothing that could be put together to make a meal? And why isn't that money going to feeding the children? So she kicked off. I joined onto the back of the sort of conga line of fury. Marcus Rashford came along and did what he does, which is brilliant, used his platform to really elevate the story and go straight to the government themselves, because they seem to listen to him, which is brilliant. And within sort of 24 hours, it had been turned around and the vouchers were being reinstated. Initially, the government doubled down. They were like, no, there's no way we're going to put the vouchers back in. And then they I think, because they're quite a populist government, if they think that they can score an easy win or look like a hero, you know, like Boris's Christmas thing or whatever, they'll do it. They'll be like, no, there's no way we can possibly do it. And they'll wait until everyone's furious, and then they'll save the day. And you're like, you're not really saving the day. You're partially resolving a problem that you caused in the first place. See also police cuts, or cuts to health services, or cuts to domestic violence. You can't just throw like a fraction of what you've already taken away at something and claim that you've made it better, because you still made it objectively worse. But anyway, the voucher system is now back in place, and children who qualify for free school meals can get vouchers from their schools, and the boxes have been massively improved as well. The main provider who was doing those food boxes, Chartwells, actually got in touch with me and were like, can we send you what we're thinking of putting in these boxes? And we had some email exchanges and some quite robust phone calls about it, actually. And they took a lot on the chin, which I thought was, well, I mean, they couldn't not by this point because everyone was furious with them and their shares were going. And so they now include breakfast, and now their lunches are a lot more substantial. But because the spotlight was on Chartwell's, they've upped their game, and they're including things like gluten-free options now, and things that they previously had said weren't possible. But other food box providers, I'm still seeing boxes going around on Twitter that have still got mouldy oranges in, or an insufficient amount of food, or bizarre combinations of products that you just can't make a meal out of. And like, even I can't make a meal out of, or I could, but it wouldn't be anything that anyone would want to eat. So it's like, as ever, the ones that were highlighted and were properly yelled at and shamed publicly have kind of sorted their act out, but everyone else isn't following suit. And it's kind of like, look, it's not a case of doing it just because people are angry with you and now know your name. It's a case of doing it because you're getting the funding to do it. It's the right thing to do. And, you know, profiting from starving children is morally, well, it's just morally, there are no morals, there are no words. It's just disgusting. And how you can boast about shareholder profits in the same breath as those shareholder profits are being funded by literally starving children is it's obscene. So I'd quite like it if they all kind of bucked their ideas up and sorted their mailboxes out and sort of, you know, did the right thing.
So yeah, I mean, but the role you played there was, I mean, you were obviously rightly, there was a huge amount of love and support for what you did there, and you know, it was shocking that it came to you having to do what you did, and such is the society we live in. Just a couple of other things. There's a couple of questions. People are very excited I was going to speak to you, so they wanted me to ask you a couple of questions, which I will now do. So John Hegarty asked, how do we build a broad anti-poverty campaign linking unions and community groups? And Chris asks, do you think we have an appropriate system of justice to support victims of dishonest or defamatory newspaper columnists? How do we stop dishonest lies and uphold standards in journalism?
Oh, I'll answer the second one first. I think that I mean, as we know, I took a newspaper columnist to court for libel a few years ago, and I won. So I think the justice system is incredibly difficult. I was very lucky to get a pro bono lawyer, and a very experienced pro bono lawyer who's very experienced in newspaper harassment cases. Although I should add that the columnist at the time hadn't published a libel in a newspaper, she published it on Twitter, but she worked for a newspaper, so carried with it the weight and the audience of that carries. But it was a very long and grueling process, and I couldn't really work throughout it because I was just so ground down by the whole thing. And several times I contemplated sort of pulling out, and was told that if I pulled out of the process, I was liable for my lawyer's legal fees if I didn't see it through, which I didn't have, obviously. So I had to carry on. So I think you have to be a very robust person. You have to have a very good lawyer who's willing to act pro bono, and you have to have the time and the energy to dedicate to it. So it's a system that, although that story, people love to tell it like I defeated the Wicked Witch, actually that process defeated me time and time and time again. And the only reason I really carried on with it was because I couldn't afford to pull out of it. So I think it needs to be made easier. I think loss of legal aid makes justice for the not weaker but the lower income party in any disputes like that much more difficult. And I think that there's a lot left to be done to ensure that people who are misrepresented and defamed and libelled can see justice brought. So although mine was sort of like the landmark case that allegedly changed things, actually years down the line I still on a daily basis and being libelled and defamed on social media and on gossip forums and other outlets, and I think the law needs to be a lot more robust about allowing platforms to knowingly publish things that may be libelous or defamatory, and there needs to be a course of action in the changing landscape of malicious commentary that helps to support the victims of it. And that's something that is quite close to my heart right now, because my God, it's been quite a year. And I don't know what the answer is, but I'd quite like people to stop saying it's too difficult to find these people, or it's too difficult, or the police aren't really up to date with it, or ever get up to date with it. Find these people, use the tools that you have at your disposal to, you know, to put as much effort into the, like, you know, the people who are trying to destroy people's lives and livelihoods, and sort it out, because at the moment it's like the Wild West out there and people can pretty much get away with anything. So newspaper columnists are possibly a little bit more careful now because of my ruling, but anonymous faceless gits on the internet are less so. And someone needs to bring that side of things to justice now, so that there's a bit of a lesson there as well. On the first one, which is, what was it? How do we have a more joined up thinking approach to tackling poverty?
How do we build basically alliances to tackle poverty, whether it be unions, community groups, civil society, I guess would be the word. How do we build those effective coalitions? I mean, it's tricky when lockdown, but generally.
I think to go back to something that that the wonderful late MP Jo Cox said in her maiden parliamentary speech, is that we have more in common than that which divides us. And I think there's a real tendency, especially in the more well-meaning end of the political spectrum, to let the quest for perfection get in the way of any good that we could do. I'm guilty of it. I've done it countless times. But in order to actually achieve, in order to achieve radical social change, we need to make sure that we unite on the issues that we commonly believe in. And I believe that is, a decent welfare state, support for the most vulnerable, a well-functioning and well-funded NHS, safe homes and food and shelter and basic human needs for all, a decent living wage. We look at the things that unite us and the common causes, that if each of us were to write a manifesto pledge, what things would be on pretty much every single one of them. And it's the building blocks of a decent, safe society and the fundamental necessities that come with it. And so if we work together on those things and stop pointing at each other and saying, oh, well, 7 years ago you said this in a newspaper article, or, well, I don't agree with you about that. You can still call out difficulties and disagreements, but you shouldn't be doing that at the expense of supporting the most vulnerable. Because I tell you what, the 4.1 million children currently living in poverty in Britain don't have the time for us all to iron out all of our bloody disagreements before they can get their next meal on the table.
Yeah. So just finally, what at the moment gives you hope about where we're heading after the pandemic?
What gives me hope about where we're headed after the pandemic? Well, I think a lot of people have experienced firsthand the impact that food insecurity can have on their own households and on the households of people close to them or people that they know. I think that a lot of people have come together to see what they can do in their neighbourhoods and in their communities in this period of time. I think people are generally more community minded than I've personally known them to be over the last few years. So I'd like to hope that those qualities continue, that we don't all get sort of, goodness fatigue at the end of this, and neighborliness fatigue, and sort of at the end of this withdraw back into ourselves and go, oh God, thank God that's over and I have to stop being nice to everyone on the street WhatsApp or whatever. If we could just continue with the sort of the community mindedness, the neighborliness, the looking out for each other, and also the mindfulness about how difficult things are for people, and that we potentially could be heading into another recession, another round of austerity, and to just bear in mind that the difficulties faced during the pandemic and how much more difficult it will be for a lot of people when it finally starts to wane, because when we're left standing in the shadow of coronavirus, for a lot of people there'll be a massive sense of relief, a sort of a thank God that's over, we can go back to whatever normal looks like. But for a lot of other people, there's going to be real insecurity. There's going to be no job to go back to. There's going to be mortgage payments or rent payments that have defaulted. There's going to be, food insecurity. They're going to be on benefits for the first time in their lives, or whatever. And just to sort of, what I'd like to hope is that people continue to take care of each other in the manner that we've seen over the last year or so, and that we sort of remember our common humanity and continue to look out for each other.
Thank you so much, Jack. It's been a huge honour. You're an inspiration. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you, and it's been a real pleasure to be here as well. So thank you so much.
We're never going to succeed in radicalizing politics and doing what must be done on behalf of the many if we do not challenge the dominance of the establishment media with our own media. So support Owen Jones's team on Patreon.